Hang on, it's taken a minute to go. So I will, okay, now 15.
All right, I think we're live and ready to go, Cameron.
Yeah, and welcome everybody. Welcome to our first Meet the Leader fireside chat. Today we'd like to welcome our guest Noah Cairns. Noah is a defense analyst. He's also the co-founder or founder, sorry, of True North Strategic Review. And of course, we know the leader, Dominic Cardy, who is also with us today. Just a bit of housekeeping. We'd ask that you stay on mute. We will be taking questions in the chat throughout the conversation, so feel free to leave your questions in the chat, and we'll get to them as quickly as we can. Over to you, Dominic.
Thank you, Cameron. And Cameron, by the way, Cameron Thomas is my chief of
Oh,
staff and
yes.
has been doing a great job helping me out. Thank you all to everyone who's watching us today. And thank you to Noah for joining us for a chat about Canada's defenses, our security. These are obviously top of mind issues as we see drones swarming across our allies in Europe, rhetoric turning towards war in the capitals of our allies, persistent instability, to call it, to be polite about it, in our American friends to the south, and a world that is spiraling rapidly towards conflict. The Canadian Future Party has been very clear that Canada has not been doing enough to prepare itself for a world that is moving towards war, and calling out our leaders, in particular Mr. Carney, Mr. Poilievre, for not being straight with Canadians about the conflict that's coming and the changes that are going to be required to ready Canadians for what's to come and to make sure that our side, the side of liberal, open societies, of democracies, can prevail in whatever conflict is to come. And recognizing that the more we do to prepare, the better chance we have of avoiding a hot war and of the values and beliefs that we all hold, of those values becoming the values that people around the world can share. Because make no mistake, we are in a conflict with the autocrats. And that conflict is getting hot across Europe, across sub-Saharan Africa. Chinese invasion barges are being tested along the Taiwan Straits as China claims it will be seizing Taiwan within the next couple of years. We know of the assorted countries that Mr. Trump has threatened to annex or otherwise occupy, and allies that he seems to have abandoned. All that in the backdrop of the hot war in Ukraine as it continues to fight Russian aggression, despite the presence of North Korean troops on European soil, Iranian drones, and Russian troops. Now, with their technology making air incursions into NATO countries, we continue to see NATO sitting back and doing not much more than sending strongly worded letters. And until we get a clear sense of the threats in front of us and how we're going to handle them, whether it's NATO or Canada alone as a country, we're going to be in a tough spot. So, looking forward to the chat today with Noah, who is being a real voice of reason and clarity on this file and has built a real name for himself as one of Canada's main defense analysts, as a group of people who we really need at this point in time.
Well, thank you for the lovely introduction, Dom. I am very honored to be sitting here with my party leader, to have these discussions together with my fellow party members. I am very thankful that I am being the first guest on the relaunched Meet the Leader. For those of you who might not know me, my name is Gairn. I am a defense analyst. I am the founder of the True North Strategic Review, as well as the writer behind This Week in Defense, Canada's self-declared #1 defense newsletter. And I am really happy to be sitting down and having these conversations with you, Dom, because these are conversations that are oftentimes ignored in the broader media, or more specifically, very narrowly focused, very political, very challenged. And as a party who has committed to a defense first focus, I believe that we stand positioned to be the ones to lead this conversation as a collective. It is something that our party policy took extremely seriously last election. We were the first party to commit to 5%, the only party to commit to 5% defense spending by 2030, ahead of even the NATO timeline by 5 years. We are the ones who have brought up munition production. We are the ones who have brought up civil defense. We have led the charge, and I am very, very happy to be joining you today so we can discuss how our party can take that to the next level, as well as maybe talk a bit more to people, because you and me, we've both kind of seen how the situation is playing out. I know you've been to Ukraine yourself. I have been following this for the last 3 years. I've been doing this for about 3 years now. So I think we are well positioned to be having these conversations with everybody to kind of get an idea of what Canada's current role in the world is, as well as maybe talk to people about just exactly what kind of threats are out there. Because the threats that we are facing come from all directions. They are digital, they are conventional, they are asymmetric. They will happen at home, they will happen abroad. And we need to be prepared at all levels of our society as a Canadian society to face those threats head on, because they're coming at us at an extremely fast pace. Our adversaries are preparing, they're active, they are actively out there planning for what is to come within, the next 5 years even. We don't have time for these long debates anymore. We don't have time to sit in Parliament and do committees. The time for action is now, and we as a party need to stand firm in our beliefs and stand firm in our model that we need to have a Canada first approach to defense. So I am very happy to sit, Dom. I know you have some questions for me, and I would love to hear from everybody who's joining us today. I want to hear your questions. I want to hear your concerns. I want to know what the people are thinking about right now, because it's very rare for someone like me to get these opportunities to sit with all of you and to really get this big community together to have these discussions.
Thank you, Noah. And I think that's the fact that you felt that the Canadian Future Party was your political home. I think I take it as a huge compliment, and it's been interesting how many folks in the defense and security world have gravitated to this party. I think because, as you said, we're the only team that's really taking it seriously. It's one of those areas that doesn't matter if your traditional home is on the left or the right. You can surely see that Canada's sovereignty and infrastructure is under threat at this point, and we need to get together and do something about it. So Cameron, just cut me off if when there are other folks who've got questions in that you want to drop into the chat. But I wanted to sort of start off, given the stuff we're seeing across Europe with drones threatening civil aviation and infrastructure across Europe the last week or so, clearly Russian in origin. What should Canada do? I mean, this is clearly an area where we've got a number of different areas to look at, both what can we do to protect our own territory, because there's no reason that drones can't be deployed here as well, although it's harder to get to us across the Atlantic. But how should this be influencing our procurement and other decisions as we look at an era of hybrid warfare unlike anything we've ever seen?
Our adversaries are taking a very asymmetric approach. The traditional belief that a lot of people have when it comes to defense typically revolves around the conventional military threats, missiles, ships, tanks, but more and more our adversaries are understanding that the way to get at our society, the way to properly target us, isn't through conventional threats. It's through things like drone incursions. It's through things like cutting undersea cables. It is going after our media, going after our digital infrastructure, things like mass hacking campaigns, things like cybersecurity breaches. All of these are the playbook of our adversaries like Russia, Iran, China, North Korea. And we as a society are not really set up to handle those kinds of asymmetric threats, because I often tell people you kind of have this idea that, Canada is very insulated, as always. We have free oceans that separate us. That no longer matters as much these days as it did 10, 15 years ago. And you mentioned getting drones over here. That is another area where we're seeing our adversaries and technology advance to the point where we are under threat from those kinds of things. It takes only a handful of bad actors with minimal commercial off-the-shelf equipment, 3D printing, very basic AI systems to create essentially similar to what we saw Ukraine do a couple months ago when they used containerized drone systems to target Russia's strategic bombing fleet. That can happen here. It doesn't need to be even imported into it. You can have a select group of bad actors come into the country, acquire those commercial off-the-shelf systems, acquire the very basic technology to guide and control those systems, and completely catch us off guard. Because the truth is that we are not prepared at all. The Canadian Army lacks a proper ground-based air defense capability outside of Latvia. Our primary focus up until now has been equipping the multinational brigade in Latvia, which is good because those guys are on the front lines. They obviously need the proper equipment ahead of most other people. But when our adversaries are coming at us and we talk about these kinds of asymmetric threats, you got to ask, okay, what can the Canadian Army do as a whole to counter it? And the truth is, Dom, not really much. We don't have prolific counter unmanned aerial system capabilities. We do not really have much ground-based air defense capabilities outside the RBS-70NG in Latvia. We do not have the proper base infrastructure. And we are getting to a point where these threats are identified. For example, the Royal Canadian Air Force is creating a new security trait specifically for base defense. However, we also have to recognize that our bases are vulnerable. They are in locations where there's heavy civilian populations. They are on the sides of major highways and places of infrastructure. That inherently will make them vulnerable because they are where people are, and you can easily blend in with those people. We need to also recognize that our adversaries are going to try and sow dissidence in our society. So the threats might not actually come from people from other countries. They might come from people within our own homes. An example that I often use with people is, I don't know if you saw it, Dom, but recently Palestinian Action in the UK managed to get into an RAF base, managed to damage two separate Voyager aircraft, which, for those who don't know, Voyager aircraft are air-to-air refueling aircraft. Very important for strategic national defense. Very important aircraft. Went in there, beat them with bats, threw paint on them, desecrated them, and then escaped into the night on bicycles, which is absolutely insane to hear about. And people will obviously laugh at that and make jokes, but we are actually in the very same position where our base security is very similar to that current state, where a bad actor or even just a group of civilians who have, an agenda against Canada's national defense can easily go to one of these bases, potentially sneak in and cause millions and millions of dollars worth of damage that can take months or even years to replace or fix. And we don't have the infrastructure in place to handle that. We don't have the equipment. And our procurement system is lagging behind the point where we can keep up with technological developments. Between the release of the counter unmanned aerial systems UR back in 2022, 2023, I can't remember the exact year off the top of my head, we have seen drone developments in Ukraine go from simple DJI drones to fiber optic drones, drones with advanced artificial intelligence systems that allows them to specifically target the exact aircraft that is needed without a human operator, because it can identify that aircraft, it can single out that aircraft, and it can target it without a human operator, resistant to jamming. Fiber optic drones, still a threat if you're unprepared for them and you catch you off guard. All of these kinds of threats, and we're seeing Russia and China produce these threats more. We're seeing Russia, obviously, with drone incursions into Europe. The past week and a half now, we've had incursions into Poland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway. I believe there was a brief incursion into Germany a day or two ago, maybe on the Danish border. We know where these drones are coming from. We have a good idea of what they're doing. And as you said, we are in the position where we're still in that phase of, we can talk this out. We don't want to escalate the situation. And even beyond that, we've seen Russian fighter jets enter into Estonian airspace for 12 minutes and loiter around before NATO was able to fully respond. And you get to the point where you ask, what is the actual policy here that we as a collective alliance are taking? How long are we going to let Russia and even other adversaries like China continue to push their weight around against us while we continue to say, stop doing that? We're going to put another round of sanctions on you. Hopefully the 56th round of sanctions will convince you to stop doing this.
2 more weeks. 2 more weeks.
Two,
Yeah.
2 more weeks. 2 more weeks, and once that deadline passes, you're going to be done for this time. Believe
That's
me,
just a joke for those who don't obsessively follow this. Every 2 or so, usually every 3 weeks, Donald Trump will come out and say that in just 2 more weeks, he's going to be really, really tough on.
Vladimir Putin, I'm coming to get you. 2 more weeks, buddy. You better stop right now.
Yeah,
But it does get the mentality that even when we're talking about the people who you would think would be more aggressive to these kinds of things, that we still don't have that collective agreement, that collective alliance based of, okay, we need to start escalating the situation. And for a country like Canada, we aren't really prepared for those kinds of threats. We certainly have many great plans. We certainly have many great projects and many great people working on these. How are we going to, by 2030, be prepared for a potential global peer-on-peer conflict, potentially with multiple peer-on-peer adversaries on multiple coasts and multiple feeders? However, we don't necessarily have that time, and the current procurement system is not quick enough to address those concerns. Even when we're talking about urgent operational requirements, the system in place to rapidly acquire capabilities, we're still talking 2 or 3 years between when documents are dropped, so an RFI or whatever they drop, to when the capabilities are actually delivered. In that time, our allies like Poland are able to sign contracts, full contracts, billions of dollar contracts within that time, while we are stuck with these small, very bare bones purchases just to get us by, really. UORs are just meant to get the necessary minimum equipment required to sustain an urgent capability, in this case, primarily Latvia. Meanwhile, our
Noah, would you say that in terms of the biggest challenge, do you think that it is, as we're facing this hybrid warfare that's both taking an online form as well as new technology with drones and other tech that we're seeing on the battlefield or near battlefield or soon to be battlefield in Western Europe? For Canada, do you think that is our single biggest challenge right now as we face this multitude of new threats? Is it around our government decision making and procurement systems? Would you say that it's more on the home front, dealing with border issues? I mean, certainly the issue that I hear most commonly raised by people in the defense and security sector is around procurement and just the fact that the system is, as you pointed out, so incredibly slow, but partly by design, because we've had a defense infrastructure for years that wasn't really about defense. It was about economic development and having little projects here and there, which suited people's political needs, weren't necessarily part of any coordinated defense plan for the country. So what's your take on that? Is this something where, I mean, clearly we need to, I think we both agree it's the reason why you joined this party and I'm the leader. You've got to talk to people about why this is necessary. So taking that as read about how there's a PR battle to be fought and won to let Canadians know about the challenges facing us, where would you, if you suddenly had a policymaker's role today and could fix one thing about how Canada handles security and defense, would it be around procurement and the legislative framework, around pushing our allies to take stronger stands? Because I share your bafflement that NATO is proud of itself for having gotten rid of the Russian fighters after a quarter of an hour when I think the Turks shot down a Russian MiG-29 in, I think it was 11 or 12 seconds.
About that, they shot down an Su-25, I believe, about 12 seconds after it entered its airspace back in 2015.
And that was totally legal, and Russia just didn't do anything because you can't send armed fighter aircraft into your opponent's airspaces, which is also an important note about what the Russians have been doing. These aren't just the usual probing attacks we were familiar with in the Cold War with unarmed aircraft. These aircraft are loaded with missiles. They are ready to go. These are on combat patrol. And it is astonishing that we're seeing it as a sign of strength that they simply left without firing at us and causing a broader conflict. Anyway, sorry, I asked you.
A lot of people will say that procurement's the big problem. For me, and it's part of the reason why I started doing this, I think the big problem at the fundamental is with the actual Canadian mindset, with the Canadian people themselves, because we're seeing a very big increase on the demands of defense from the public. We've seen the public say we want a stronger military, we want more military defense spending. We're concerned about our sovereignty and security. And for a lot of people, they're like, okay, that's great. What I see is you kind of have the mentality of, okay, when is the pendulum going to start swinging back? And I think we're already starting to see that now that we're talking about budget. It's budget season, everybody. We're about a month away from the first Carney government budget, and now we're starting to see the talks of deficits, amnesty. We're starting to see the talks of what could get cut, who's going to get what funding. And now we're starting to see the public shift back from their commitment of, we want you to spend more on defense. We're okay, we're going to do it. Not like that. No, we don't want the big deficits. We don't want program cuts. We don't want to go for all this. And the truth is that defense is always going to be a budget item. It's always a large budget item that's going to be the first to be cut. Because at the fundamental part of the day, a lot of people don't understand our national security concerns, and they are often holding on to ideas that haven't been true in decades. One of the ones I like to bring up is, of course, peacekeeping. If you go around to the average Canadian person, typically over the age of 30 or so, you're going to hear the fun statement, Canada is a peacekeeping nation. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, but that has not been true for the last 25, 30 years. After everything in the 90s between Somalia and Rwanda and Bosnia, we kind of pulled ourselves back from peacekeeping. We haven't been a peacekeeping country in my entire life. I am a grown man. I have 3 daughters. We have not been a peacekeeping country within my lifetime, for reference. But those mentalities still hold on because defense is just such a non-important topic to the Canadian media discussion, to the Canadian political apparatus, who, like you said, primarily see it as a way to create jobs, as a way for economic development. Even now, we're still seeing the conversation primarily revolve around economic development over sovereignty and acquiring the capabilities we need. We still have that. We need to talk about the economic balance. And that's great because you do want a healthy defense industrial base. However, when you put too much focus into the economic side of things and not enough into the we need capabilities now, because we have allowed everything to sit rusting out for the last 20, 30, 40 years. And it goes back a long time. You could probably go back all the way to the 60s when the Department of Defense production was basically thrown out the window. And we went to our current model of procurement, where we did not have a dedicated agency, where we did not have a centralized authority on procurement. And we've seen reforms happen time and time again. The 2014 reforms under Harper that created the current system that was supposed to fix everything, did not fix everything. We've heard about it in, the 2017 defense policy. Procurement reform was coming. We've heard about it in the last policy, our North Strong and Free. Procurement reform is coming. We're still waiting to see what that reform is. We know it's going to be a centralized agency, but we don't know exactly. But to the topic at hand, for the majority of people, they don't really understand Canada's security requirements. They don't understand Canada's security threats. They still have the notion of, well, we're separated by 3 oceans. They started to listen once, everything down south started happening. We started to hear the rhetoric of the 51st state and, maybe we won't protect you in conflict. Then people got very, very concerned. But now as their priorities shift again, suddenly defense is no longer a topic that people want to discuss. So to me, the primary issue is, obviously procurement is a very big issue. Our procurement system is a mess. It is over bureaucratic. It is slow. It is completely risk aversive. That is a problem that we as a Canadian society face, that we are extremely risk aversive people across every sector and domain. We don't like to take big risks. We don't like that challenge. That is something, but that goes back again to the core problem of it is the Canadian mentality to me and the Canadian perception of defense that is the primary crux that is always going to be that knife in the back of our security apparatus. Because as soon as something happens, as soon as something gets cut, as soon as the deficit looks a bit too bad, you can guarantee that defense is one of the first things that's going to get cut, because the average Canadian does not really care about it. They don't really want to think about tanks and planes and ships and whatnot. To them, you cut it, okay, whatever. We can move on. We have NATO, we have the United States, whatever. So to me, the primary concern.
What do you think we can do to change that? Because I think that the points are raised. I agree with them. I think it's a kind of a natural function of living as the neighbor to what has been the world superpower.
The world's only superpower for the last 30-something years.
Protected by the oceans, at least the illusion of protection. So, but given that some of these threats are going to be probably more conventional, and I hope that our minds as a country aren't focused in the coming weeks, months, or a couple of years by an actual conflict breaking out. But I don't think that the good money is against war.
I don't think we have that luxury of even debating if there will be a conflict. I think it's a matter of when within the next decade, maybe even less. If you are in the Canadian defense kind of sphere, in that community, you will often hear the term, we have 5 years to prepare. That's been true since 2022. It's still true now. We still hear that we have 5, maybe less now, years to prepare. Maybe things in Ukraine kind of slowed some ambition down. Maybe it made our adversaries kind of rethink what they were thinking about, but we still have that, in the next 5 years, we could potentially be in a major conflict.
I think it's pretty likely. I mean, that I would guess that unfortunately we're looking at that being sooner. That if you look at what Russia is currently facing with Ukraine's increasingly successful attacks on its energy infrastructure, that Russia is reaching a point where it's running out of time to undermine Western democracies through hybrid warfare by. We saw yesterday a Russian-linked politician from Nigel Farage's party in the States, rather in the States, in the UK. All these bad actors merging together. Reform in the UK, one of their leaders admitting that they were a paid Russian agent. This is happening over and over and over again. We know the far right in France, the Miss Le Pen's party took millions of euros from the Russians from a Russian loan a few years ago. So this is that was a very successful way of dividing Western economies, Western societies, creating dissent, turning us against each other, even if it didn't make us pro-Russian. And certainly I think Russian efforts there have been massively successful. So if we're looking at Russia probably facing a decision about having to escalate because they're running out of traditional tools, then I think a couple of years, if we're lucky at this point, and given some of the announcements that we were chatting about earlier with both French and German hospitals making calls out to their health system.
Preparations, and
be ready
we're
right
seeing
now for
there comes like a sort of point where the threshold is crossed, where Russia understands that it won't be able to keep up with NATO and with the West, because we have to acknowledge, we are significantly larger economically, we have larger population bases. There comes a point when we start to take defense seriously, where that curve of Russia's initial advantage of having that preset production, because they've been for the last 3 years, obviously ramping up production, ramping up a war effort, switching to a wartime economy, they maintain that material and production advantage. But that, as long as we can keep to our current commitments and everyone can keep to what NATO has set out in their capability blueprints, that shift is going to come where Russia is going to fall behind, where they won't be able to catch up. And we have to realize that they've realized that for years. That's been something that they've been realizing since the Soviet times, that eventually, they have to play catch up, and eventually they won't be able to play catch up. So there is this kind of pressing matter, similar with China. They're in the stage of, when is the optimal time to go after Taiwan? We hear dates as early as 2027, where we might see Chinese, and like you said, we're already seeing Chinese efforts to build up a potential amphibious fleet. We've seen the barges. I think we've all seen the barges by now, lined across the beaches. We've seen the preparations. We've seen and we've heard them talking about, how they're going to do this. And like you said, part of it comes from the art of deception. That's a big thing. The part of malign actors going after our society politically and culturally to deter us from intervening, to deter us from building capacity, these bad actors. All of these are things that are being done actively. And they're being done actively because our adversaries know that they are going to have to act within the next couple of years. That is kind of that threshold.
Yeah, I think it's somewhat analogous to the situation Japan was in, I think, at the beginning of the World War, where they were starved for resources, and the Russians can't necessarily rely on China and India to replace all of the lost energy and other imports that they were getting from the West, that they have to be looking at a certain point that it's a now or never situation. So so you've touched a little bit on procurement, but the next big thing there you said, which I think is totally true, is that we have an attitude issue in Canada, that we've got to get serious about this. So the last gasp of the pre-conflict stage for the Russians is going to be to try and continue to just divide us as much as we can. And Lord knows they've had some success. We've certainly done our own, and I don't blame foreign actors for all of this stuff, but from convoys to First Nations blockades to Hamas enthusiasts on the street to the now new and new and even more exciting than Quebec independence movement happening in Alberta, with
Yeah.
a referendum coming next summer. So the opportunities for disruption and destabilization in Canada, I think, are going to be huge the next 12 months. And we continue to be divided over the science of vaccines, around the role of the United States, all the other things that are ripping Western societies apart. We continue to not have any sort of compelling narrative to recapture the best of the West and talk about how we're the inheritors of this incredible tradition of freedom and equality and working together in the pursuit of individual rights. Something that sounds oxymoronic, but it's actually been the most fantastic experiment, successful social experiment in the history of time. So as we continue to try and figure out, and I hope this party can play a role in defining that, how we sort of do a sort of a civilizational defense and start talking about why Canada is a great place, despite our history with all the flaws that all countries have, and how we continue to make things better. How do we push back the next little while? Because we're going to have the we've had attacks, for example, on Nova Scotia Power. The community of St. John here in New Brunswick had a cyber attack a few years ago, lost all of their data. And we see the bad actors led by Russia with enthusiastic Chinese and Iranian support roles attacking our infrastructure, creating division on social media. So what can we do to prepare ourselves to defend ourselves on the home front? Because that's an area where you've identified that as being the single biggest challenge. Solving that deals with our procurement issues, deals with our lack of, sort of societal resilience in the face of some of these threats. So what would you like to see, again, if you were a policymaker right now, today? How would you like to see Canada prepared for the challenges that are come, and what tools do you think that policymakers can use to wake Canadians up after years of, I think, our governments, again, having been kind of complicit in trying to keep us as dozy as possible on this by making it seem like these conflicts are in faraway places about which we know very little, which is far from the truth.
To me, it starts first with acknowledging that it will not be easy and it's going to take a long time. I feel like I need to get that out of the way first whenever we talk about these discussions, because it's not going to happen overnight. The big thing, obviously, is we need to be transparent. We need to be open about the threats that are facing us. And it's something that both CAF, the DND, and the federal government itself has really struggled with, about being open and transparent about those threats. We've had situations, and I don't know if this is really public even, we've had unidentified acoustic sensors pop up within the Northwest Channel within the last 2 years. I don't know if that's really public. I haven't yet to hear it in public, but it's very much something that should be brought up and mentioned to people. And even if some people will say, well, that happens. And yes, it does happen. However, when you don't identify these issues with the public and you don't get them feeling, this is an actual thing that's happening, because you either want to save face, or you don't want to get people worried, or you don't want to expose your critical gaps that you might have in your own capabilities. The more you focus on those things, the more you isolate yourself and the more you keep the public in the dark about the threats that are facing us. One of the big things I like to bring up is, of course, subsea cables. That's one of the big things I like to bring up. We have about 4 subsea cables that run from Canada to Europe across the Atlantic. They contribute about 99% of internet traffic runs through these subsea cables. We've seen cuts in Europe for a long time. We have had cuts here. We don't know if they were maligned actors or accidents, because these accidents do happen. However, when you don't bring up these vulnerabilities and you don't bring up these issues and you don't bring up, okay, this is something that did happen, this is something that we do not fully have the capability to respond to in an appropriate way, especially during conflict. There are free cable laying vessels in Canada. They are all over 15 years old. I believe the oldest is going about 40 years old. We don't have the infrastructure in place to do that. So first of all, getting people just educated is the absolute first step. That requires a federal government that's willing to be open about what it's doing, about where money's being spent, about what capabilities need to be acquired. That involves a Department of National Defense that's willing to talk about these issues, to talk about the threats, that's willing to publicly go out and say, hey, this happened. This is the stuff that's going on right now. We need to be out there. And most of all, we do need a whole of government approach to this. It can't just be the Department of National Defense. It can't just be CSIS. It can't just be a couple of organizations and departments just kind of clumped together and kind of depending, okay, who has what authority, who does this, who goes out here and does this. We need a whole of government approach that says we as a society are under threat. the liberal world order that we have been building up for decades now, the liberal world order that gave us the very brief period of peace within the 1990s that we thought was going to last forever, it is under threat. It is under threat not just from our adversaries, but some of our traditional allies and malign actors. It is something that, through all intents and purposes, needs to be protected at all costs. You need to get people involved. You need to have a campaign. You need to have the legislation in place and the actual system in place where you can access this information, where people can feel confident going and getting this information to not have to be hidden in secrets. As someone who does analysts, as someone who does this practically almost full time now, defense analysis, I can tell you that getting information is extremely hard. If you go and you want to access the information, it's going to cost you. It's going to take a long time. You're going to not really get many open, transparent documents about it. It's a complete mess of a system. And when someone like me who does this and who has the time and who purposely goes at this stuff, who knows what to ask, can't get access to the information, how can we build a civil society that's prepared and understands these threats when they don't have the same knowledge or education to go and get that? When they don't have the knowledge and education available to them through the media, through the government, to actually understand what's going on. It starts when you talk about the conversation. And from there, you have to ask yourself, what do we want society to do? It's a whole of society approach. Security and Canada's national defense is a whole of society approach. You need a whole of society approach. That means getting people involved in ways I know is part of the party policy, and I love it, so I'm going to bring it up. That might involve something like a civilian corps of people who are prepared. That might involve getting youth involved and teaching them the proper skills, what to look out for, teaching them what the threats to Canadian security are, getting them actively involved in things that are directly affecting them, whether it is things like forest fires, natural disasters, whether it's, getting them involved in things like cybersecurity or similar asymmetric fields. You have to get people involved. That means you need the programs out there for people to tackle. You need the messaging out there, and you need the infrastructure in place to do that. And again, love to bring up the party policy of having those civilian corps. I think that's a great idea. It's something that I would love to see the current government really tackle at. It's something I know that certain provinces like Ontario, with the Ontario Corps, are starting to tackle. But we need a more centralized, more definitive organization to handle that. Perhaps there's some work that can be done in intermingling. Of course, the provinces need to be involved. Indigenous communities have been involved in their own security and defense initiatives, whether it's the Rangers, whether it's the Inuit Marine Monitoring Program, whether it's the Indigenous Guardians Program. We do have these frameworks out there for civil defense, for people to be involved. It's about getting them out to the broader Canadian public that has presented the challenge. And if you want a collective security, if you want to make sure that Canada is prepared and you want to make these issues at home, you need to get people involved at the very basic level.
So that will be, so we were chatting a little bit before we went on air about the talking about the Ukraine example where they had so much of their civil defense was organized through municipal officials that they learned lessons from the annexation of Crimea and the attack on Donbass in eastern Ukraine back to 11 years ago now by the Russians. And by the time of the full-scale invasion in 2022, they had municipal governments ready with small weapons caches, basic training for people. And when I was there in September of 2022 and talking with some municipal officials who'd literally been on that front line, it was the Ukrainian civilians who were able to hold the line and give time for the Ukrainian military to reorganize and push back the Russians, for example, from Kiev. The capital would have almost certainly fallen if it wasn't for the civilian defenders who, with some planning, rose up to defend their capital city and their country. And so that gets into that. I think that we're absolutely on the same page around how we need to prepare, and we've got to have some formal central structures. So
it takes baby steps in that regard. It's going to be a long process. You have to acknowledge it's going to be a long process.
But how do we square that? How do we square that with what we both agree is a very short timeline before probably a hot war breaks out?
It's difficult. And I'm not going to say that it's impossible, obviously, because we we've wasted so much time. Let's just, if we can be honest, we've wasted so much time. We've wasted years and years and years pushing back on these issues. We've wasted years pushing back on what needs to be done with commitment to funding, commitment to development, commitment to acquiring the capabilities, where we are now at that stage where you're right, we might not necessarily have all the time that we need now to get to that point. And I don't want to sound, all depressing saying that, because I'm a very hopeful person, obviously, but it is something you do have to acknowledge, that we did waste the prime years where we could have been doing things. We could have been doing things since 2014 when Russia first took Crimea. We could have been a lot harder back then. We could have been preparing. We did have, of course, the 2% NATO commitment that had no real consequence if you didn't meet it. And we all skimped out on it for the last decade of just pushing it to the side and saying, well, we'll get there eventually, 2035 and whatnot. And you should call those people out. You should call everybody out, whoever did that, because at the end of the day, this problem exists because we ignored the very clear threats. We ignored the signs. We let our national security basically dilly-dally and said, well, we're now concerned with coin ops, and, we're now concerned with this and that, and we're going to keep our relationship with Russia because, yes, they took Crimea, and yes, they obviously have ambitions for more of Ukraine, but, they're good business. They're cheap gas, cheap oil, and I'm not calling out any particular person. We're all guilty of it. I'm not calling out specific countries or regions who maybe shouldn't have done certain things. I get it. But at the same time, you're right, we're firmly squaring this position of we need time, because these kinds of societal changes take extreme amounts of time. They take extreme amounts of energy and effort and financial backing. They can't be done overnight. And we have a very short time frame when we have to get people educated, which is why conversations like this are so important, because we are now in a crunch and we need to have these conversations now, because we are quite literally at that ticking clock going to midnight, and we are still having the same debates we've been having for the last 10, 20, 30 years on what to do on a foundational level and what to do to get ourselves prepared. And the truth is we won't be fully prepared if a conflict comes before 2030. There's no way we're going to be fully prepared. That's just the simple fact of it. We are going to be playing catch up no matter what position we're in. So now it goes from how do we get the perfect to how do we prepare as best we can, and how do we kind of make the foundation so that when conflict does break out, at least we're not going into it with absolutely nothing. And to the credit to the people in the DND and the CAF, they are thinking about that. I've seen the plans. I've talked to people. They are very much thinking about that. It's constantly on their mind. They have also been trapped in this situation where it's been a lot out of their control when it comes to things like funding and mandates. The CAF can only do so much with what they're given. It's a shame that we're at that stage. I give them full credit for trying to get as prepared as possible. But the simple truth, Dom, is that we won't be. In my mind, we won't be ready by the time that we need to be. And I can't think of a conceivable timeline where we can get to that stage within this very narrow timeline.
So that gets back to why it's super important for us to, as a country, start this national conversation, get people involved, because otherwise, the longer we wait, the more powerless people are going to get. And I could not agree more with what you were saying earlier about transparency, that we're going to lose our edge in the free world if we don't start using the tools of the
that we have available,
fluid, being transparent and open. And I know, Cameron, you've got a couple of got a question or two to come in, so maybe you can take those, and then
yeah, I got a thought from Rob around small arms and generic shell munition factories across the provinces. I believe it would create many jobs as well as provide domestic security, and finally provide Canada with an additional export to increase our GDP.
Thoughts on that, Noah?
Yeah.
Well, we do have, the funny thing is, for those who don't know, we actually do have a munition supply program. It's not really talked about too much. We do have it. It is limited to 5 different companies at this moment. It is extremely limited in what can be produced, just because those companies, of course, are limited by what production they have. I have openly talked about needing to expand the munition supply program, because even with the companies that we have now, and primarily when it comes to artillery shells, we're looking at General Dynamics and IMT, who are the 2 producers of artillery shells. right now in Canada. They have the basic exclusive rights to produce artillery shells. And again, it's limited to two companies. And it's been like that for a long, long time. And for a long time, it has worked for us. It doesn't work now. We, as a party, have talked about setting up a new munitions organization, one that has the actual mandate to support munitions production with funding, with a clear mandate, with someone in charge specifically centered towards munition production. That we, as a party, committed to 1 million shells, which is good because it's an area where we can absolutely tackle. When we talk about the defense industrial base, we tend to look at it from a wide arcing perspective of we need to kind of do what everybody else is doing. We need to produce this and produce that, produce this, produce that. When the core function is sometimes it's good just to be the guy who is very specialized in producing one or two or three things really, really well in really, really, really large quantities. So the answer, yes, we do have a problem with our munitions supply program. It does not procure enough munitions. It is not big enough. We are not expanding our artillery production fast enough. And part of that comes from trying to, again, get that funding in place. There is funding in place for expanding munitions supply. It's about formulating the plan. You're going to always see that, the whole, we need to create a proper plan. We need to chart this out. And of course, the companies themselves do have to actually set up the lines to produce it. At the same time, no matter how much you try and get these two individual companies to produce, they're always going to be limited by their size and their manufacturing footprint. You can't really change that, and it's not going fast enough. And we're talking, right now we're at that 5,000 shells, maybe about 5,500 right now, and it'd be great to double that, but it's still only 10,000 shells. Yeah. You're not producing nearly quick enough, and you're not going to be producing quick enough to actually build out the proper supply that you need, especially when we're still talking about, oh, maybe we'll have a new line with new shells producing in 2027, 2028. Well, I'm sorry, but the invasion of Ukraine happened 3 years ago. We do not have 5 years to get our artillery production, a very basic thing that we have shown time and time again is extremely important to the modern battlefield. Ukraine is expending hundreds of thousands of shells per month. We don't necessarily have the time to sit around and dilly-dally and have these discussions, but here we are having these exact same discussions.
Right. Is there a role for, this is an additional question from Rob, is there a role for the provinces in terms of rezoning to handle arms?
I believe there is. So I believe that getting the provinces involved is a very important step. Obviously, same with getting Indigenous communities involved. There is, of course, a lot of dual-use industries that tie into things like artillery production, whether it is the actual fuses or detonators or the critical mineral supply to actually build them. You do need to get the provinces involved. That some provinces are getting more involved in the defense side. We've seen Ontario release their maritime strategy. We've seen them commit to shipbuilding. That is a good first step because it's a province actively getting involved. We've seen Quebec, obviously, is now in these stages. I don't know whether they're going to release it this year. They're in the stages of setting out their own kind of little defense industrial policy for, giving a bit of an upkeep to certain defense companies in Quebec and giving them some funding. So there absolutely is a role for the provinces to play, not just in funding, obviously, but also in helping coordinate the infrastructure needed. Like you said, creating these zones and the industrial footprints and the industrial capacity to actually ramp up production and say, hey, we have this area available. We have everything you need to come and set production. There has been interest in foreign countries. I know there's at least one Ukrainian drone manufacturer who's kind of come to us and said, hey, we potentially want to set up a safe supply here. When we're talking about companies like Hanwha, for those of you who follow me, who have seen my work on Hanwha this month, we're seeing that whole, you can play a role, you can play a safe supply. And that is somewhere where we have to be involved again at a whole of society approach. That is Indigenous communities, that is people, that is the provinces, that is the federal government, that all have to be involved in these decisions and in making sure that everything is in place to get those companies and to get that infrastructure and capabilities built here.
That was great, Noah. I had a question that sort of ties in a little bit to that, just talking about how we most effectively engage people. This is the Canadian Armed Forces planning to use Canadian-based reservists as cyber operators or signal intel specialists to support overseas operations. What would be the pros and cons for recruitment, retention, and deployment? So I think we've seen on the one hand a little bit of a pushback against what people are saying is sort of the woke military and concern with people's standards of physical fitness and stuff like that. But I've also talked to lots of people in the defense world who say, "Look, we're more than happy to have out-of-way kids in their parents' basement if they can get online and help us with hacking, with breaking into enemy systems and operating drones." Yeah, that how do we need to look at how we can engage young people both in a traditional and more non-traditional way in preparing for this conflict and hopefully to deter it. But I think you and I are both on the same page that we sadly have probably missed that moment, but still worth fighting for.
There, so for everyone's reference, I am 24 years old. I am part of that lovely young community out there that is the prime targets. Maybe a bit younger than me, obviously. Nowadays, that feels weird to say. A bit younger than me now is probably the more prime targeting age. But
It only gets
if
worse.
you're,
It only gets worse.
it feels very weird saying that now, but it's to engage on young people. It's very hard. I work with a lot of teenagers myself. I'm active in my own community, trying to work with teenagers and youth. Obviously, have 3 little girls. I'm involved in school functions. I'm involved in seeing all these people and talking to other parents and talking to their kids. What do you want to do? Where do you see your life going? And you do have to find ways to attract them. It is very difficult. There is a lot of competition in the job market for a lot of the skill traits that we need. Again, you talked about cyber. The cyber field is obviously highly competitive, and for a long time, CAF was not at the stage of really being the best offer that a lot of them had, whether it comes to pay, whether it comes to having to relocate your entire family, whether it comes to career advancement and opportunities. And again, we're starting to see that shift where CAF is understanding that. Recently we had the pay raise announcements and the reforms, which is now offering major incentives to getting into critically efficient trades, because about half the trades right now, a bit over half the trades, have a shortage of skilled people that they need. Targeting young people is a major point that you have to consider. However, you also do have that major competition. You have to get them involved and interested. That means you can't, go out there and be like, hey, join CAF, defend your country. That's great. Everyone has used that recruiting method forever. It doesn't get them. I believe everyone Topsy mentioned a couple weeks ago, where he talked about the Australians, and their whole proposition with the Australian Navy is, go out, see the world. You got to create this experience. You got to get them wanting involved. You got to get them thinking, go out there, get this experience. You can build a career here. You can go and have a career out of here. There's excitement here. There's dynamic career opportunities. There's a bunch of different pathways you can take. You have to get young people involved. Another thing I want to bring up also is the Naval Experience Program. Being in the Atlantic, I'm sure you know very well about it. I hear that has been a huge success. You go in, you get a year where you kind of get the feel for what it's like to be in the Navy, and then you have a choice. Do you want to stick in this or do you want out? You don't have a commitment. Programs like that are a great way to target youth, especially who might be, in that I don't want to commit yet to where I want my life to be. However, I might be interested. You need to kind of create the environment where youth feel involved, where they feel like there's growth opportunity, especially, and they feel like there can be careers outside of the armed forces or a plethora of careers inside the armed forces. And there's growth opportunities and, diverse range of portfolios. You really do need to build that out and advertise that. And the CAF does try its best to get there. And it does try its best to get out, oh, look at all the trades. But it's not really enough when you still have the whole traditional mindset of recruitment, where you're going into the office, where you're not active on social media, where you're not engaging the youth and where they are. Going to schools is great, but when you don't have a good social media presence, you're not really going to be capturing a lot of the modern youth, I'm sorry to tell you. And while there is a great, we're going back to it, there's a great plan, a great document you can find right now that goes into how the Department of National Defense is going to get out there into the world digitally. It's a great plan. I don't know when it's coming. I have not seen anything from it yet.
And I think part of that, it comes back to this your central point around how until we have the conversation around attitudes in the country,
Attitudes, modernization of mentalities.
they're all going to be stuck. They're all very, very restricted in what they can do to push because it's so counter to the way that our major political parties are presenting the challenges facing the country, which continue
If you're
to.
not keeping up with technology, you're not keeping up with the ways that children and teens especially engage with the world. If you're not keeping up with what their demands are, they want rewarding career paths, they want diverse opportunities, they want, to go out there and do exciting things, but they need to be told about all that. They need to be engaged on their level. And when you have organizations that are not fully up there when it comes to, again, things like social media presence or getting out there, and might not have the same options and opportunities as, say, the private sector. We just had a pay increase specifically for this reason, because CAF struggled to compete with the private sector for
Yeah.
top-notch talent because they couldn't keep up with the pay that you can get in the private sector, the quality of life even. People don't necessarily want to be, these days, kids don't want to be having to relocate across the country or to remote, isolated communities. And that goes back, of course, to decisions that are a long time ago made. Things like closing urban bases, especially, I think is one thing I hear a lot when talking to people, and I agree, was a very monumental decision that might have greatly affected and exuberated this crisis, because now you're out of the community, you aren't engaged. And now we're seeing a shift back towards, we need more local engagement, we need more local presence, because when you are isolated from the country, when you don't have a presence that the kids can recognize, when you aren't competitive with the private market, of course, you are not going to get anyone to come and sign up for you.
Yeah,
You're
it just
you're
makes sense.
basically the worst option. That you're presenting yourself as the last option in case everything else fails by that point.
And then you wonder why the strategy doesn't work, especially when we're not putting service and national service front and center as being something that's
Exactly. It goes back to that conversation of, if it's not front and center, they don't feel engaged, they don't feel involved, they don't have this connection at a community level. And yes, we have programs like cadets, and I love cadets and all that. They're great,
but
but
they,
it's not enough.
so
It
this
does great,
so,
it gets people in, but
so as we're looking at, we got just a couple of minutes. So give you a last quick question, because one of the things that I look at is that concern over just the speed is the amount of time we have and the speed required to build up our conventional forces. It's just not there. So we've got to figure out ways that we can build stopgaps. I think as civil defense we've touched on a little bit, but something I was in Taiwan a couple of years ago as a guest of the Taiwanese government and got a tour around of some of the ways they're handling some of these issues. And one of the things I was most impressed by was how they had talked about the same challenge of not being able to engage Taiwanese youth about the imminent threat of Chinese military action to destroy their democracy. And we all know it's coming. The Chinese have said it explicitly. They are building, as we talked about earlier, fleets of thousands of barges that have only one purpose: to invade and occupy Taiwan. Those are built. They are now deployed and ready for a political decision by Beijing. So Taiwan had found that one of the most successful ways they had to push back was by engaging civil society organizations. So they call Chinese Communist Party influencers online little pinks, which I love. It's a nice way of disparaging them a little bit without being too rude. And they had an NGO there called the Ministry of Truth, which was a great name, who's just spent their time in figuring out ways to engage and push back against Chinese online misinformation. And this had both a short-term effect of helping to sort of help clean up the news a little bit from disinformation, but also is helping to build a network that they hope they can count on if, God forbid, they're put in the position the next 24 months or so of having to defend their island against Communist Party aggression. So what do you think about, we've only got a minute left, about ways we can engage civil society to mobilize youth to be involved in this project that hopefully has a bit more trust than government and collective institutions might have right now?
You absolutely need to engage them at a civil level outside of government. That includes engaging them in their schools. That includes engaging them in the homes. That means putting it front and center. Again, that means a social media presence. That means getting influencers in social media actively involved in the discussion and the promotion of civil defense and these issues. It also means getting them involved. Like you said, we talked about things like cadets. We've talked about a Canadian Future Party, an actual civilian corps, getting them involved in that. You really have to, what's the proper term? You really have to charge them at home at a personal level, beyond just the government narrative of what can government organizations do, what can CAF and the DND do. You have to engage children, especially again teens, where they are. That's again online. That's in their schools. That's in the places where they are active. That means being proactive and getting people like cadets, like again the Coast Guard, who is now under the DND. That means getting a whole civil society approach to how do we tackle getting kids involved in international defense. Of course, that goes back again to, does Canada have the NGO environment to pull that off? And do we have the civil society and civil environment and infrastructure in place to actually do that? Because we, for a long time, have allowed our NGOs and a lot of our, civilian organizations to be attacked, to be degraded, to take a lesser role in society. We've allowed with our unions to kind of be pushed to the side, and unions are another great way of getting people involved and engaged, because not only do they have those same core skills that we might need for civil and national defense, but they also have the people and infrastructure in place to be actively involved in the process of getting people prepared. So it's about engaging people like the unions. It's about engaging companies to be more open and out there about civil defense and bring kids in to have these discussions. It's about having our universities involved in civil defense.
Goes back to the Ukrainian and Taiwanese models of just looking for any collective institutions you can find to make sure they have a plan to help.
And that's the great thing, is that we do have great institutions. We have a wonderful, one of our biggest strengths is, for example, our highly advanced education system, our university system. Canadians are overrepresented in Silicon Valley, in the halls of Harvard and Oxford and Cambridge. Canadians are usually within the top 5 largest demographics, despite our small size. We have a highly educated population. We have these institutions. We have a highly unionized workforce with healthy, active unions who are major parts of our civil society. So how do we get them more involved in our civil defense? How do we get them more involved with getting the message out there to young people, to everybody really, of, hey, this is our collective security. Your collective security doesn't necessarily mean picking up a rifle. It doesn't necessarily mean even being in the Canadian Armed Forces. It can mean so many different things, because security is a whole of society approach. And getting everybody involved and teaching them that it doesn't have to just be a military perspective for national defense. You can go and you can be an engineer and build bridges, and that's great. That's
really going to be if there's one big thing I take away from our conversation, it is that core of how we have got to change the Canadian conversation. What it means, not just what are our security goals, what is our defense posture, what do we want our foreign policy to be? It's getting Canadians involved, and then the government has a leadership role in opening doors and working with some of these other institutions, even if not to directly lead and manage those processes, at least to make sure that we've got toolkits on offer. So Noah, we are now just a bit over our time, but thank you so much for taking the time to.
Oh, absolutely. We need to engage as a party in these discussions again, especially because we are going to eventually get to the point where we as a party have to ask ourselves, are we going to follow the inevitable trend when society says we don't really care about defense? Or are we going to stick and be like, no, we understand the seriousness of the situation. We have these talks within our party like this regularly. We have open conversations as a party, as a group, where we discuss these issues, where we all come together and we understand that they are imperative, that they are a major focus of Canadian society. So when other parties decide that defense is no longer a care because people are starting to tune out, are we going to be the party that follows them and chases the trend of what people want? Or are we going to be the party that says, no, we need to get back to this discussion. We need to talk about defense. We need to stick to our guns with our allies, and we need to step up more than what we are obviously doing now. And we are stepping up a bit more. However, even that still isn't enough. Are we going to be that party that follows the same trend as everyone else, or are we going to stick as the defense and security party, which is something that we took in the last election? I feel that we took that mantle, that we are seeing the party's policies venerated nowadays when we're talking about 5%, a conversation the party had that you and me had before Donald Trump was ever even in the conversation topic. We had that 5% by 2030. All these issues that we as a party talked about last year before any of the American stuff even happened. Are we going to stick to being that party, or are we going to stick to following the trend and doing what all the other major parties are doing?
Promise you one thing, Noah, as long as my name is next to the leader's title in this party is going to be committed unequivocally a strong defense, to a clear posture in defense of democracy, because unless we defend democracy, I've been in countries where governance has collapsed. If we don't protect our institutions, and that doesn't mean pretending there's nothing wrong with them, as the liberals are too often inclined to do. If we don't protect them, then we've got nothing left. And places where they pull things down usually regret that pretty quickly. So it's going to be a core of this party as long as I'm involved. And I think most of our members are here because they recognize that we're confronting issues that others aren't. The need for reform of our institutions to save them, first and foremost, has to be defending our democracy. So Noah, thank you so much for being with us today on a Meet the Leader session. For me, Dominic Cardy, leader of the Canadian Future Party. Merci à vous tous et toutes pour votre participation. Send me a note if you want to at leader@thecanadianfutureparty.ca, or you can give me a call on my cell, 506-238-5550. Please don't call me between 2 and 6 a.m. time. Thanks again, Noah. Look forward to, we'll have a note about the next chat. And Noah, we'll keep on talking, and let's make the Canadian Future Party the place for Canadians serious about defending democracy and a bright future for our country, including your 3 daughters. Talk to y'all soon.